the timeline for Black people is not neatly mapped onto what we think are the times for the American Revolution, because this fight for freedom and liberty extended beyond 1783. And again, we had a discussion about in the War of 1812, there was another offer of if you side with the British, you can be free. So this is a continuous negotiation of these external forces and these decisions that so many Black people had to make in this early Republic period.
Greetings, everyone.
Greetings.
My name is Sage Morgan Hubbard, and I'm the Director of Learning and Engagement here at the museum. And we want you to know that this building that you're in, the African Meeting House, has been here since 1806, so we're celebrating our 220th anniversary. And we're really excited that now we have like 6 months of this exhibition, Black Voices of the Revolution, have been across the street in the Abel Smith School, right? And it's really exciting work. And this couldn't have happened without these two amazing Black women scholars in front of me. And I'm really excited to introduce them and have you hear more about their work from their own words. And they'll talk more about, but this is one of the first times that we've ever included our archaeological digs in an exhibition, or some more women's voices. And that's some of the specialties of our two presenters today. So we're gonna get started with Dr. Nedra Lee from here at UMass Boston. And then we'll follow up with our own Chief Curator and Director of Collections, Angela Tate. So without further ado, I'll welcome up Nedra Lee.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming out tonight for our conversation about the organization and the creation of the exhibit of Black Voices of the Revolution. Thank you, Sage, for the wonderful introduction. Thank you, Dr. Tate, for inviting me, and also thank you to the museum for this opportunity to speak with you all about the archaeology. The archaeology is one of the things, what I am so happy to be here is archaeology has long been an important part of the vision of the museum when we begin to talk about the role it was supposed to play in both not just sort of being a source of information about the Black past, but also in terms of the way in which it was supposed to be a method of preserving the past. For those who may not be familiar with what archaeology is, I'm going to start off with with just a definition. So archaeology is the study of the past through material remains. And one of the things when you begin to talk about African American history, archaeology is very well suited to begin to uncover African American history, because by its emphasis on what has been left behind, oftentimes the sort of small everyday items that we use in our everyday lives, it is a perfect tool to address omissions in in the written record, or outright just gaps and biases. And so when we begin to talk about an exhibit geared towards uncovering individuals who were impacted by the revolution, whose voices have oftentimes been left out about that, I have to start off with a little bit of actual history. And in particular, I have to go back to September 10th, 1973. And why I'm going back to that date is because the early director of the Museum of African American History, Byron Rushing, actually testified in front of a Senate committee about the creation of the Boston National Historic Park. And when you think about this park, this is actually a park that in particular is not just dedicated towards our city of Boston, but in particular it has a focus on Boston's early revolutionary history. And in his testimony, while he was in support of the creation of this park, he ultimately gave a warning to the senators. And in that warning, he actually cautioned against a too narrow focus on the city's history during this period. He wanted to remind politicians during this time that the Revolutionary War did not spell freedom for, that the end of the war, did not spell freedom for enslaved Black people. And instead, In his call for the creation of this park, he instead put forth a vision of a network of parks and landmarks that didn't just celebrate the city of Boston's Revolutionary War history, but that also commemorated the struggles and the lives of non-white men and women who fought for their liberty and freedom. Now, central to Byron Rushton's vision was the collective use of both history and archaeology as a means to both uncover and also to preserve the record of non-white people's battles to obtain the aims of the Revolutionary War. Now, while African American sites continue to be underrepresented as historical landmarks, the collaboration between the Museum of African American History, with the National Park Service, the Northeast Museum Science Center, and in particular my institution, the University of Massachusetts at Boston, has broadened traditional understandings of this nation's fight for freedom and independence, in particular with both the restoration of buildings such as this and the use of archaeology. And in particular, and as we're going to see further on in my talk, it is actually through the archaeological study of sites both in Boston and Nantucket Island that we actually can see this broadening of of traditional understandings of the Revolutionary War and its impact, not only on our nation, but on people of African descent. Specifically through sites such as this one, the Boston African Meeting House, the Nantucket African Meeting House, and the Boston Higginbotham House, the archaeology in conjunction with the history has demonstrated that the American Revolution actually yielded different promises and opportunities for African Americans and other people of color, ultimately extending their fights for freedom and independence long into the 19th and 20th century. And why I'm ultimately sort of emphasizing that is because as I continue to talk about the archaeology, one of the things that will stand out for many of you all is the sort of long history that extends not only just from the war, but also into the 19th and 20th century, that the artifacts that are represented not only in this slide, but also in the exhibition that you will ultimately see there. That brief introduction was to sort of also, again, to really want to hone in on the fact that not only was archaeology central to the vision as a tool of preserving and uncovering information, but specifically the Museum of African American History deserves to be recognized for its long use of archaeology in this way. For example, when we begin to first trace this history of the museum using archaeology in its educational programming and activities, we can go back to 1975, when following almost 2 years after Byron Rushton gives that very moving testimony in front of the Senate, that we actually see him collaborating, or at least reaching out, with the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities, doing in an effort to actually do archaeological excavations, not just here at the Meeting House, but also in Roxbury, trying to preserve sites that are significant to local history and also, not just to local Boston history, but also that in particular shed attention to the role of African Americans in communities such as Roxbury and also here in Boston. In particular, we're going to start off here with the African Meeting House. Extensive excavations in particular have taken place at the museum's 2 campuses here in Boston and Nantucket. I've mentioned the African Meeting House, I've mentioned the Nantucket African Meeting House, and the nearby Boston Higginbotham House. But to emphasize how much of a role the archaeology has played in this, I'm going to start off with right here with the Boston African Meeting House, with its first excavations taking place in 1975. Now, one thing that some people oftentimes may not know is that the museum actually had its own archaeological program. They had a staff archaeologist by the name of Beth Bauer, who was who was the staff archaeologist and who actually began these excavations. Excavations right here took place in 1975, 1976, 1978, 1985, 1995, 1999, and then in 2005. And one of the things that I want to point out again is that the archaeology is always happening in tandem with restoration efforts that are happening here. So as historic sites and historic structures are ultimately being identified, that are being designated for being saved, the archaeology is being used in tandem with it, not only as a tool to preserve, but to always use to uncover further information about the use of those sites, about the purpose of those sites, and also as a tool to engage with local communities to ultimately get involved in sharing their history and learning this history. So it's always been a multi-purpose effort. The Boston African Meeting House is actually one of the most extensively excavated sites right here in Boston. And it's actually important because it is considered one of the oldest surviving church buildings in the United States, built in 1806, but also important because it became the center for the nation's abolition movement and the early fight for school desegregation in Boston. I am going to primarily focus on the 2005 excavations, which were conducted by University of Massachusetts, Boston, under the guidance of my colleague, Dr. David Landon, who is the Associate Director of the Fisk Archaeological Research Center. But one of the things that I should point out about these excavations in 2005 is that these particular excavations, many which actually yielded the objects that are featured in the exhibit here, yielded approximately 38,000 artifacts and focused on 3 areas. In particular, the West Alley between the African Meeting House and 2 Smith Court, the back lot of the historic African Meeting House, and the South Yard, which was once part of the property at 44 Joy Street. Now, why these particular locations are ideal is because of the scale that they give us in terms of understanding African American life. We both have a glimpse at an institution that was at the heart of the struggle for not just, which later became the heart of the struggle for Black freedom, for fights for autonomy and self-determination, but we also had a look at the ways in which local households were ultimately impacted and also engaging and interacting with the institution along those struggles. The artifacts recovered from the African Meeting House, in particular from the back lot, date from roughly 1806 to 1840, and they give us information on the activities that specifically occurred right here in this building. For example, they shed light on the community meals that oftentimes took place here. They give us insight on the business activities of the caterer Domingo Williams, who resided right here in the basement. In contrast, the South Yard, which was located, that was once part of the property at 44 Joy Street, dated to 1811, from 1811 to 1838, and ultimately contained the trash of several African American tenants who resided here. Historical and archaeological research shows that the existence of institutions like the African Meeting House were magnets for African American settlement. The excavations surrounding the African Meeting House revealed that activities related to the construction and remodeling of this building and adjacent structures were significantly represented in the archaeological assemblage. The archaeology also supports archival findings which also suggest that the housing around the African Meeting House was actually dense and characterized by many multi-unit dwellings or tenements. So to be honest with you, it's actually very similar to exactly what you see today. It would have been, we were in an urban city where people would have lived in very similar apartments. One of the things that I ultimately really, that I love when thinking about the archaeology is that it also showed that residents showed great ingenuity with their responses to the urban settlement here. They laid out extensive drainage systems to deal with the water. It also had a church and a school to address the educational needs of the surrounding population. And both of these institutions were well equipped to deal with the health concerns of a rapidly growing population of young kids that ultimately lived here. All of these programs were guided in particular by principles of self-sufficiency and racial uplift, reflecting the political sort of mobilization, all that emanated right here from this structure. The archaeology further corroborates some of the historical research that we've seen in books written by people, by sort of James and Olive and Lois Horton, when they talk about the neighborhood being comprised of both Black and white skilled and unskilled laborers. But one of the things I like to point out, and that we oftentimes see reflected in the artifacts, is that while many African Americans worked as day laborers, some were also employed as waiters, as mariners, cordwainers, tailors, and hairdressers. The archaeology recovered large numbers of ceramics, of glass, of also sort of items related to the service, the preparation, and the consumption and disposal of food. And all of these things point to the large number of African Americans who were also engaged in not just the sort of community building activities through the large, through dinners here, but also that were engaging in food-related occupations as a way to earn money. It is actually those items related to food preparation, service, and consumption that were represented in the second highest number, second highest quantities. I should also point out that institutions like this were central to drawing, again, that the Black population clustered near these institutions. And so as these institutions continued to rise, they became central to helping people and drawing people in their sort of in efforts to escape slavery on the Underground Railroad. And in a thesis, because one of the things I should point out is that the archaeology on each of these sites has been a source of numerous theses and dissertations for several scholars and archaeologists on sort of African American life in New England. And one of the things that I think is really important to point out is that when we begin to actually take documents like the 1850 census and we begin to actually put them on a map, we actually found, and this was actually cited in a thesis by a former UMass Boston student named Justin Malcolm, that there were actually large numbers of children that lived right here in this neighborhood, and that the population of Black people that were clustered around not just the meeting house but the 12th Street Baptist Church, that it was actually that the presence of a school and a church in particular that made neighborhoods such as this quite ideal places for families and safe places to raise and to rear children. In fact, Malcolm actually even went back further, looking at an 1833 census, and found 1/3 of Black inhabitants in the city lived in alleyways, courts, places, and rears of buildings. On Beacon Hill in particular, Black people were especially concentrated on streets such as Belknap, Southwark, May, and West Cedar Streets, pointing to how strong these institutions were in providing sort of support for the local community. And let's actually move now to Nantucket. So we're going to talk a little bit about two structures that are also part of the historic campus, the museum's historic campuses. The first is the Nantucket African Meeting House. Now this, similar to the Boston African Meeting House, was the first dedicated church structure in a community, in Nantucket Island's earliest free Black community. The name of that community is known as the New Guinea community. Some also refer to it as Newtown. The Nantucket African Meeting House first housed the African Baptist Society, but which later became, that was established in the 1820s, and that later became known as the African Baptist Church, which later became in 1831 the York Street Baptist Church, which was then followed by the Pleasant Street Baptist Church. So one of the things that I always like to point out about this particular structure is that it actually housed 3 different religious institutions over the course of its history. It also housed a school, which we know as the African School, which was in operation from 1825 to 1847, and also similar to the Boston African Meeting House, became a central location for anti-slavery activities and for providing general support to the community that grew up around it, that was in New Guinea. The Nantucket African Meeting House was also a site of continuous excavations, beginning first in 1993, followed in 1996 by archaeologists from Boston University, where they recovered 14,605 artifacts. You know, one of the things that sometimes people ask me is, why the difference in the numbers? Seems like such a different scale, but similar, but such still large activities. And I oftentimes point to the fact that some of this has a lot to do with the fact that in a little bit difference from Boston, Nantucket is actually, we would probably talk about it in terms of it being a village. It's not necessarily as urban as we would think of Boston. And one of the things is that it was actually a very highly transient community, largely because of the whaling industry that emerged during this time. However, it does not mean that it still did not, that we still were unable to see the similar activities. We still see the having of community dinners. We still see the hosting of a school. And the one thing that we did say that stood out was, while they're also still having similar events, we also actually see individuals holding other events on other sites on the island in parishioners' homes, perhaps opening up questions about just different uses of space on Nantucket Island. Very similar to also in Boston, we also see that they equally dealt with issues of poor drainage. Whereas in Boston, we see the construction of large numbers of just huge drains to deal with water. There, they just, ultimately did and just moved heavy amounts of earth to put large amounts of dirt to fill and level it out to ultimately deal with the fact that the church ended up being built on a natural ravine filled with sand. Research by Sean Fairweather revealed that there was a correlation between gender, family, and property ownership when it became time to look at the involvement of various residents in the Nantucket African Meeting House. For example, a review of the minute book from the Pleasant Street Baptist Church revealed that there were 72 members of this church between 1848 and 1852. 52 or 72% of these members were women, and 20 or 28% were males. All of these were residents of the island, with 1/3 of them owning property. Now, one of the reasons why I'm pointing this out is because that means that when we begin to think about institutions like the African Meeting House, we begin to think about the construction of churches and schools, that there's also a strong effort for people to establish roots there. And so land ownership becomes a really significant characteristic of community life right on Nantucket Island in New Guinea. Of course, we cannot talk about this institution without talking a little bit about the nearby Boston Higginbotham House. And here, the Boston Higginbotham House gives us a little bit of a contrast. Similar, you can see here we have another household where excavations, oh, I didn't mention the whale burial. We have a whale burial also on the property of the Nantucket African Meeting House. That's my favorite piece of that part of the archaeology there. What a way for people to ultimately show that they are mariners and that they have a connection to that place and to the work that allowed them to be partially in that place. In 2008 and 2014, we ultimately conducted excavations right here at the Boston Higginbotham House, which sits literally right next door to the Nantucket African Meeting House. These excavations were rich. They uncovered 80,000 artifacts, post holes, a stone footer associated with an early barn, 2 privies, which are outdoor toilets, and a retaining wall. One of these privies ultimately gives us a really good in-depth life at the earliest occupants who resided at this property, who were Seneca Boston and Thankful Micah Boston. Now, Seneca Boston was a formerly enslaved man on Nantucket Island who was gradually manumitted. He marries a Native American Wampanoag woman named Thankful Micah, and they raised their children right here at this property, which is actually at 27 York Street. They are the parents of this gentleman that is pictured here, and this is Absalom Boston, who was one of the earliest, was a black whaling captain on Nantucket and actually had quite a successful voyage on his ship, the Industry. But I want to point out to you right here, this privy, is where we actually found the deposits that actually give us a look into the life of the earliest Boston residents. But one of the things I should actually point out is that the Boston Higginbotham House was continuously occupied by 2 African American families, the Boston family and later the Higginbotham family, for 200 years. So we get a really, really long snapshot of not just life within this community, but also we get to look at the ways in which life in this community was impacted by race and class, and the way in which it would have impacted the ways in which individuals would have ultimately tried to obtain and get freedom. We have another privy that actually dates to 1822. We can talk later about how we are getting these dates. And that actually was tied towards the family of freeborn Boston. That was actually Seneca Boston and Thankful Micah's firstborn a son who was actually born free, hence the name freeborn, and Mary Boston, his wife, later widow. And we ultimately get an idea of their lives through these two structures. Her life is actually represented in this privy here. What does this tell us? What kind of information can we ultimately take away from this? So there's three things that I want to first point out to you all. So the first is that the archaeology at these three sites marks the location, and I want to emphasize the location of African American communities with thriving churches, schools, Black landowning households, and businesses. This idea of marking locations is really important because, as I mentioned early on, that historic African American sites are underrepresented when we begin to think about sort of our record of, or a National Register of Historic Places. And when we think about the vulnerability of many of these communities that are, some of them are very much known towards sort of local history, towards memories, but they have not been formally documented. And so the archaeology becomes a physical record of these places. The second thing that it ultimately gives us is that it actually begins to force us to think about, again, the limits, okay? When we talk about the Revolutionary War, and when we think about the words of Byron Rushing, when he talks about how this was a fight that it did not immediately spell freedom for enslaved people. One of the things that I like to point out is that each one of these communities are free Black communities, and they're free Black communities that ultimately emerged with the ending of the Revolutionary War. Each one of these communities emerged as slavery did not immediately but gradually came to an end in Massachusetts. And so they ultimately give us an idea of exactly what that looks like along the long duration. The third thing I like to point out is that the families that were in these communities remained here for decades across multiple generations, and that the households in these communities were culturally diverse. So one of the things to go back to point out is that when we begin to think about the Boston family in particular, I mentioned that this was a family where Seneca Boston, who was a formerly enslaved man, married a Wampanoag woman. And so even as we're beginning to think about race and beginning to think about a sort of politic and mobilization around not just sort of the abolition of slavery, but around the ways in which people are becoming increasingly cognizant of Blackness as a construct that is marking people as, in some cases, as slaves, as inferior, that there's also sort of at least cultural interaction and exchange taking place in these households. And we can actually see that first with the discovery of Native American ceramics such as these, which are ultimately sitting right next to ceramics that would have been American and British made, that would have been imported. That both Black and Native people are using these ceramics in conjunction with the cultural interactions that they are experiencing and taking place and also creating. We're also seeing it here with a paint pot and a grindstone, which would have been used to ultimately grind different types of medicines. But we also see it alongside basic cooking implements of everyday life. And what does this ultimately suggest to us about the Revolutionary War? It reminds us that the fight for independence yielded separate implications for African Americans, that it did not yield the widespread abolition of slavery, and it ultimately thinks us to heed the words, perhaps, of this being the start of one of our earliest unfinished revolutions. So, thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Selvin. I'm very excited to be able to be in conversation with Nedra Lee because I have seen this as the ideas around what museums can do outside of its typical collections, the stories that can be told when you engage with things that are beyond text. And so I wanted to think about why this story matters. It matters because traditional narratives focus on the founding fathers. When I first moved here, I actually grew up in Northern Virginia, and Northern Virginia always thinks that it starts the revolution and the founding of the nation, but then everyone here in Massachusetts says, not so fast, it's us. But that also still is a particular narrative that centers white men. If you take the Freedom Trail, it tells a particular story about the American Revolution that takes you far, far away from Beacon Hill and this black community that, as you learned from Dr. Lee's presentation, is absolutely amazing. Secondly, black voices reveal deeper truths around what is liberty and freedom. As they were saying, we're fighting against tyranny, we're slaves to the British. They were also enslaving not only African Americans, but Native peoples. And then this exhibition restores their presence to the historical narrative and also restores the story of this neighborhood and of this meeting house, because it's more than just the story of abolitionists, it's more than the story of the 54th Regiment, it's the story of a black community who engaged with the ideas around what does it mean to be this new identity as an American. And so I want to talk about where I started when I thought about this amazing exhibition. Thank you to Massachusetts 250, which Dr. Trent wrote for shortly before I joined this institution in the summer of 2024, because I also learned that Massachusetts said our 250 starts in 2025. The rest of the country is the following year. And so again, coming here and, I was trained as a public historian, which is what is history? How do people engage with history? How do people think about history? What is some of the myths around history that are past and why? And when I was going through a lot of research related to the American Revolution, I suddenly stopped on this passage from Paul Revere's account of his ride, his midnight ride, that everybody knows or thinks they know, just like I thought I knew. And a friend of mine was a journalist and was at MIT as a fellow at the time, and she said, "Did you hear about Mark Codman?" And I said, "Who is that?" She was like, "Go back and read his account." And he says that he saw the British, which is where he was able to then ride on to Concord and, out there where there's lots of things happening related to the American Revolution that I will not get up at 4 a.m. for. He says he stops where Mark was hung. And so once my friend said, look into that, and I realized, wait, Mark Codman, who was an enslaved man who several decades earlier had been convicted along with his sister and other enslaved people in the household of conspiring to murder their owner. And so if he was still a landmark in this time period, several decades after he was murdered and then hung in a gibbet, that meant that there is a black history to the American Revolution. And then later on, I learned that the person who was said to have drawn the only known portrait of Phillis Wheatley, Scipio Moorhead, was sold to slavery by the Liberty Tree and disappeared from the historical record. And so I just thought about, here are these myths, here are these stories, here are these monumental ideas around the American Revolution, and there is a black history attached to every single one of them. And so the curator's lens that I brought to this was, what is the story that people think they know? What is the story that they should know? And also, what is the unique story that we can tell and only we can tell at this museum? And so when I thought about Massachusetts, thinking that it's 250, it was 2025, and the Americas, thinking that it's 250 was 2026, what does that mean for who says we're first, who says we are the marker of major events in history, and then what does that mean for us thinking about this moment in this 250th era? And so I thought about making connections to this broader vision of everyone wants to know about Black history, they want the Black institutions to tell that history, then they go off and say, well, I learned it at the Museum of African American History, my job is done. So I wanted this to broaden the ideas around, I go see this exhibition, my curiosity is satisfied, I've fulfilled my learning experience for Black history, for the American Revolution, and love our community partners, but there is this idea that that's where you go when you actually want to be engaged in a lot of really fascinating history, and that this is just a theme of the major historical moments that they want to learn about. And so I started thinking about how do we center marginalized voices? And that's also why this exhibition is called Black Voices of the Revolution, because it isn't just about hearing Black people, but where do they emerge in the archival record? And so that's why this, when you walk into the exhibition, I tell everybody it starts to the right. Everybody goes to the left, but that's okay. The right is where our methodology section is, which is where do we find Black voices? How do we find Black voices? And when I was doing my preliminary research, I had discovered that some of the earliest writings about Black people were these kind of disturbing narratives when they were on death row, essentially, in the 17th century, and that this was a popular genre of literature for the early settlers and colonists here in New England. And when I was making this connection with Dr. Nedra Lee about archaeology, I suddenly thought, well, I'm a trained historian, and trained historians use documents. And so if I'm finding these silences in the historical record and archives, well, archaeology fills in some of the material and materiality of these voices that have been silenced. And so I also like to point to Marissa Fuentes, who in her Dispossessed Lives talks about reading against the archival grain, because that is the way to find Black voices in places that people don't normally expect to find them. And so again, like I said, the revolution we know, liberty and independence narrative, enlightenment and enslavement, Black experiences also reveal contradictions. But what is the actual lived experience of African Americans at this time period? Because we can talk about slavery, we can talk about the abolition of slavery, but what is the actual everyday life? And so one of the things that I did want to highlight were some of the materials in our collection. So this is William Cooper Nell's Colored Patriots of the American Revolution. He wrote this in the 1850s at a time when they were dealing with the Fugitive Slave Act, when they were dealing with people being able to be snatched from the streets of ostensibly free cities in the North and being said, you're enslaved, you're owned by this person, we can take you back to the South. And so at this time, he's using this book to say, I'm not only a historian, I'm going back through the archival records, I'm finding all of these references of the Black experience in the American Revolution, but I'm also pointing to the fact that we were central to the founding of this nation. Therefore, slavery should be abolished. Therefore, freedom and liberty for African Americans should be automatic. And what that means for the Black presence in New England is that enslaved and free Black communities lived alongside each other. The early churches, as we are in the building right now, and societies which were founded in what is now known as the Susan Paul Room, were also a part of the fight for abolitionism. And also, if you were to go into Smith School, we have a lot of names on our ceiling in the entrance, and it points to all of the people who were here before this building actually existed, such as Prince Hall. And so I also wanted to think about this being a space of Black intellectual life, because a lot of people don't think of Black people as thinkers, as theorizers, of people who are actively constructing what it means for their existence to essentially exist. And this is why I'm so excited to be in conversation with Dr. Lee, because thinking about these two sites in New Guinea and also in Boston's Beacon Hill, and looking at them on the map. So we carefully chose maps that would highlight where these communities existed in this, I guess, late 18th, early 19th century, in order to say, look, they have been captured on a map. Because a lot of times when people look at maps, maps tell you who exists, who is legitimate. So the fact that these neighborhoods are on these maps in this early period shows that they were still being counted, even as though people thought that they were not legitimate parts of the American Revolution or the founding of the early republic. And I want to point to a brief timeline of Black participation in the Revolutionary War. So everyone knows about Crispus Attucks. Then we think about petitions for freedom, then also the end of slavery that comes out of Elizabeth Mumbet Freeman and Quock Walker cases. And if we move to the themes of the exhibition, I really wanted to focus on freedom versus bondage, resistance and resilience, community and legacy, and women's history. And I've gotten a lot of great feedback on women's histories because so many women were involved in the fight for the American Revolution that it's often looked at as just battles. And I always tell everyone, I am not a military historian, so don't ask me about wars, but I can tell you about what was happening on, even though they didn't use this phrase in this time period, the home front. And so, again, one of the amazing things about this museum is that we have such a rich collection. This is our copy of Phillis Wheatley Peters, and we wanted to highlight her as a full married woman by using her married surname. instead of the idea of her as this child prodigy who was severed from the Black community. And I also wanted to point to the fact that, again, like this frontispiece is attributed to Scipio Moorhead. This is the only known illustration that we have of her. And she also dedicated a poem to him in this book of poetry. So she isn't severed from the Black community. She isn't this anomaly who was existing in the Wheatley household and had no other connection. And I also points to thinking about how this site was a communal space. It wasn't just a bunch of individual Black people experiencing things alone. They were all together. They were all thinking about what this meant for each other. So when I was still working at the Smithsonian, a dealer came to one of my supervisors and said, "This poem has not been exhibited or read since 1998. This is the original manuscript that she wrote when she was coming back from England after being celebrated by British abolitionists." And I love to think about how she's writing this poem. She was free in England, and then she comes right back to America where she's in bondage again. And just being able to see actual handwriting and also to hear her words and to think about what she might have sounded like, what she was thinking as she was taking this voyage back to bondage after being paraded around London, after the Wheatleys showed that she was educated, that she essentially at this time had a soul, which meant her creativity came from her and was not regurgitated as Thomas Jefferson wrongly wrote in his Notes on Virginia. It humanizes this experience of this young woman who everyone later on deified and saw her as this lone figure. So I want to think about the Boston family of Nantucket. You learn so much about the actual material culture, and I always do love talking about archaeology because I did think I wanted to be an archaeologist until it was hot and dusty. And there were bugs, and then I was like, who's on the inside that collects all of this? I'm gonna be a curator. Especially whenever, as you showed in your slides, all the best materials are found in a privy, AKA a toilet. So yeah, no. But again, as Dr. Nedra Lee explained, they're an African-American Wampanoag family. Seneca Boston, Thankful Micah, built the home in 1774. And this is why this museum is so exciting, because we have the spaces in which these people lived and worshiped and played and read and rested. And we're not just in a constructed building that has objects. The building itself is the object. And here's the photo of Absalom, Boston, and the paint pot and the grindstone that's in the exhibition right now. The other theme is Black soldiers and sailors. Even though I'm not a military historian, people do still want to know about the war. And what we focused on the war was Lord Dunmore's proclamation and how he offered a segment of Black people freedom, well, freedom in quotation marks, by saying if you join the British, you will be free. And that so many people who took that offer up ended up in a more complicated situation. They went to Nova Scotia. Some of them were sent back to the Caribbean and re-enslaved. Some of them were sent over to West Africa to found what is now Liberia and Sierra Leone. And they did not find the freedom that they thought they were going to get. And one of the other things that is exciting about this museum is that I have met some descendants of people who said, my family did go to Nova Scotia and they came right back to Boston. So this is living history. This is history that's walking among us every day, and things that we shouldn't forget and that are not so far away from us. Another object in the collection. And again, we're talking about the intersection of race, gender, and revolution. So much of the history is focused on men because men tend to have the privilege to leave written records, not just about literacy, but also who had the leisure to write their thoughts, who was told by society that they were allowed to have thoughts to be written down. And so when I thought about the fact that the original orientation of a lot of the themes did not include Black women's voices, we really thought really critically about like, how do we represent women, particularly when many of them did not leave written records and most of them did not leave renderings, so we don't even know what they look like. Another original document from Belinda Royal. So the Royal House, slave quarters in Medford, also another important site to visit just up the street. And Dr. Kiera Singleton has done a wonderful job of exploring the Black history of a site that was not intended to talk about the enslaved people. And then again, we wanted to talk about the legacies of the American Revolution because this did not end in 1783. I always had conversations with Dr. Trent during the making of this exhibition and said, the timeline for Black people is not neatly mapped onto what we think are the times for the American Revolution, because this fight for freedom and liberty extended beyond 1783. And again, we had a discussion about in the War of 1812, there was another offer of if you side with the British, you can be free. So this is a continuous negotiation of these external forces and these decisions that so many Black people had to make in this early Republic period. And that's Lord Dunmore's proclamation. And then we can go inside the exhibition. So this is from the rear of the space. We also have this interactive with Black Women's Voices, where you get to flip through a book essentially and look at how they made the decisions they made. And one of the fascinating things about using AI technology is that we can create these closed data sets from primary resources that allow people to learn from the historical record. Here are our archaeology pieces in the collection, and that is Dr. Nedra Lee's favorite piece. So we get to talk more about that. And then again, as Sage mentioned in the intro, we've been open for 6 months now, so we're thinking about audience engagement for youth groups, for children, field trips. Also, how do people engage with this exhibition when they come visit, particularly as we move into the national celebration of America 250 in July. And there's also the question of how our international audience is going to engage with America 250, because we have that huge FIFA event coming this summer, and there's gonna be people from all over the world in Boston looking and engaging and thinking about our history and what does it mean for us to be celebrating 250 years. That's our opening, people looking at our interactive echoes of the past and some of the patriots versus loyalists, and then closing reflections. Black voices are central, not marginal. Their stories redefine the revolution. And then, thank you. And then we can move to questions.
Thank you for this presentation. I'm actually a former UMass Boston archaeologist.
Nice. Oh, wow.
Many years ago and everything. And so I know for you and me, for the program, one of the big things is how does this research help us make better worlds today? And I know the education is really big here, but I'm also an urban planner now, so I'm wondering how, if and how this research is being used for like the reparations task force for Boston in support of that research. So I think Field and Greenwich are doing tough.
That's an excellent question and an excellent point. I will confess that we have not actually thought about that. I mean, I'm aware of the commission, but ultimately, you know, sort of taking our research findings and directly saying this is its relevance to the work that you're doing, we have not done that. What I will say is much of our work has primarily concentrated on trying to make the findings accessible. And accessible to, dare I say, sort of a lay public, you know, archaeology can be a very difficult vehicle to talk about the past, as much as we have very lofty ideas about it when we say, you know, oh, within the sort of everyday sort of items, you know, we can reclaim these voices and fill in these gaps. But people oftentimes ignore the fact that it's very fragmentary when we get it. I mean, you see bits and pieces of that right here in the pictures that we're showing, but how that translates both into when you think about, for example, exhibits, you know, and how you sort of take those sort of pieces and begin to connect it to not just sort of facts and people, but also processes, is one of the sort of challenges that we continue to grapple with. And so much of our work has been directly in terms of, not just in terms of continuing to interpret the archaeology and keep it studying and using it in sort of pedagogical purposes, but also to create digital tools that allow us to sort of intersect and complement what you see with exhibits like this. But you raise a really excellent point, and I think that's a challenge to us even more with this exhibit is to continue to work on taking what we've learned from it to make it relevant to the sort of debates that we're having right now and about repair.
So I was kind of interested, you said the church in Nantucket was a Baptist church, but it was 3 different ones. So I don't know, how would I learn about that, or can you fill in the gaps of what happened and why they changed? Thank you.
So there's a thesis. I'm going to recommend my student share Sean Fairweather's thesis to you. And one of the reasons why this thesis is really amazing is because he uses the archaeology and the existing documentation, and there's very little documentation about the actual church activities. In fact, one of the things that we were really surprised about when we were studying the artifacts from the African Meeting House was, so Nantucket is primarily known for its association with the Quaker faith, and that has a very heavy lens in terms of how you even talk about not just the history of the island, but religious history in the island. And when we started going back through trying to figure out, okay, African Baptist Society and this, what's going on, we actually went back through, he went back and reconstructed all of the histories of more than 13 churches. And he went to the Nantucket Historical Association, the island's archives, and started looking at records that were left by the Congregationalists. And so in many ways, some of what you're seeing in terms of the splits, they're actually splitting over slavery. So there's a combination, so in some ways, even before we see the African Baptist Church, many of the Black and Indigenous people on the island are actually members of the Congregationalist Church. And as the fight over, do we abolish slavery or who's voting for it, they start splitting. Or how people are being treated in the churches, they start splitting it. And so the African Baptist Society is directly a response to people saying we will not be mistreated, in terms of worship. It's also a response to the fact that the Quakers do not accept any Black and Indigenous people into the Friends group. Now, some of the later splits are actually internal, and those are actually where it gets interesting. So if you go to, there's a minute book, and it's the Pleasant Street minute book. I actually have it written down. I think it's PBSC. I'll give it to you later. But that actually gives you a little bit of sort of internal drama inside of the church. And some of those are sort of fights over doctrine. Sometimes they're just because these are all family members. They're all very close family members. And they argue about, who is being more religious, who ultimately is following the rules. And what we later found out is even as we see several Baptist churches, there's actually a Zion, an African Methodist Episcopal Zion church that gets founded directly almost across the street over. So we're still filling in some of this. There actually isn't a really robust sort of documentary record for it. Much of what we were able to or what Sean was able to reconstruct came from having to first go to the records left by several of the sort of predominantly white churches, then finding that sort of minute book and then piecing it together with the archives. So I would say if you want to learn more, actually start with Sean Fairweather's thesis, which puts all those sources together to do that. It's actually really fascinating, but the splits are heavily being driven over fights over what is our position on the abolition of slavery and how are we going to treat other Black congregants in these places of worship.
I'll also add that this museum is also moving towards interpreting our religious history. So look forward for programs and more interpretation and other things related to that in the near future.
So this wasn't always a Baptist church, or was it a church that had different denominations in it? Or?
It was a Baptist church, yes.
The same for Nantucket. They were always a Baptist church. But they interact with the Methodist church a lot. And so the way in which we think about, sort of strict denominational boundaries, they don't really observe that. They're in community, they're in worship together, they fellowship together. Again, their family members go back and forth. That was the one thing that stood out about, the sort of Pleasant Street Baptist Church, is that, they have this split, and several of the wives go over to the other church, but they still come back the next Sunday, or even during the weekend, they still worship together, or they're still having teas together. They're still very much, when the desegregation, the school desegregation fight pops up, they are right then together, fighting together. So it's not quite the way in which the sort of denominational battles, it's not the way in which we think about it in terms of these strict boundary lines.
I was wondering if you had you come across any writings or information about the founding, the structure, and the reasons for it. And we could take a guess. You want to place, freely. That's my assumption. But I remember when I've been to the Old South Meeting House, they've talked about how the African American population had to be balconies. So have you come across any, either in the archaeological record or the written record, about like, okay, we need to come together and really have the structure for ourselves, maybe it would have been, I guess, 40 or so years after structures like the Old South Meeting House. I wonder if you had any information about that the relation between the maybe more well-known historical buildings of Boston to someone coming here from Texas or California or something, and the need for a place like this.
When the early community built this church in 1806, it was both a response to the segregation at the white churches and also a response to self-determination, building their own spot essentially on this north slope of Beacon Hill to say, this is our community. We're building a space for us, not in response to being rejected, not in response to being told we aren't allowed to sit in the regular pews, but we're a community coming together to build something for our own edification. And as you've heard from Dr. Lee's presentation, this wasn't just a place of worship. This is also where people were educated. There were a couple of business owners who lived in the basement. So this space isn't just a reaction. And I would also say a lot of our interpretive lens is that this was a space for justice. This was a space for abolitionism, but it wasn't just in reaction to what was happening outside of the community. It was, as you said, people are fighting it inside of the community. So there is no perfect, nothing is happening within this space. So when we're thinking about 1806, when this is finally erected, we're thinking about a community who chose to come together and say, this is where we are, and this is where we're gonna build our community. And then you can talk about the archaeology.
The archaeology doesn't necessarily show conflict that clearly in terms of the way in what your question is asking about it. I would actually argue that the archaeology shows probably fellowship and efforts to, a consistent effort to build community through those institutions. And so the thing that is most prevalent in the material culture, it's always the remains that are associated with food, both the sheer number of food remains and the sheer number of just ceramics that we find. So the one thing that I think that stands out between the artifacts from the Boston African Meeting House versus the ones at Nantucket, so just the sort of sheer volume of people having to prepare food here at the Boston African Meeting House. You see it in terms of there's a bunch of containers for storing food. There are several examples of matched ceramic, sort of like vessels where people would have, literally been intentional in terms of, what they're serving and on what, in terms of probably sort of to various guests, and also the number of individuals who worked in sort of food-related industries. Nantucket is a little bit different because what we see less evidence of people preparing food at the site and them storing food, but there's a lot of evidence of people bringing food to the site. There's a lot of evidence of teas and luncheons. Like there's a lot of teaware. Many of them are different colors. And so that one is really sort of like it is clear evidence of it's a gathering place. And it is a gathering place regardless of even when they're having a split. Now, the other thing too that I oftentimes point out, and I oftentimes say this to my students when we're studying it, that people are very intentional about their connection to place in Nantucket from the beginning that community is founded. So once you see many of the sort of white slaveholders beginning to gradually manumit the enslaved people, they are immediately trying to buy land. In fact, Seneca Boston, even while he is still under he hasn't even been fully manumitted yet. If you look at the date, even though some of the privies are, sort of an early 19th century context, the deed is as early as 1774. And so he is working early on to set up his home and to leave a place for his family, which I think is very intentional about not only creating your household, but about building community. And there is a huge wave of this. You just see it with everyone. There's a beautiful letter that Seneca Boston's brother Essex writes to the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. And he talks about amongst this place, there are colored people, and he's referring to their relationships with also Native peoples. And so they're very intentional about place and about staying in that place. And one of the things that stands out is that if you trace their deed records, even following, Nantucket has a massive fire in 1846, and you see this sort of like departure. Well, actually, even before I go to the fire, even though many of the men who leave are mariners, right? They always come back. So women stay there. And so there's a very strong evidence of women playing a role in the transmission and also the holding of property. They hold that property for literally almost 100 years. The Boston Higginbotham house stays in the hands of the Boston family for almost 100 years. When Florence Higginbotham buys that property in 1920, it hasn't even been, I think maybe almost less than 5 years, is it not within the Boston family's hands? And you see that across the New Guinea community. So, when we talk about sort of the role of these institutions, I always sort of say that they are all about the active process of constructing and holding an attachment to place and keeping people rooted in it. And it's not that they do not have conflict, they do. But I think that there's a broader political sort of principle that people are ultimately being guided by in their everyday lives that the archaeology really sort of shows us in terms of that.
I'm interested in school groups that have come to see the exhibit, and what have they found the most surprising?
For one, the young people are fascinated by the archaeological objects in the cabinets. Just being able to see the material culture and the way that these Black communities and these Black families live their lives and the things that they've used have been very, very fascinating to them. Seeing the evolution of objects. We have a 3D print of some of the objects that are in the exhibition, and so pulling out the iron that was excavated in the archaeology and passing it around to students, and students saying like, oh, I had no idea that irons went back this far, that they used silk weapons and things like that, has been a very common reaction related to the objects in the exhibition. Another big thing that students have been really grappling with, and we've seen a lot of aha moments about, is exactly what Angela was talking about, is this multiplicity of battles going on during the American Revolution. So they're very, very familiar with the refrains of liberty and independence, but in every single class that we've worked with, emancipation has not been a word that's in their vocabulary. And so it's startling, but the students that we've interacted with are not so familiar with the word emancipation. So one, we define it because it is one of the key words of the exhibition, and then we introduce emancipation as a key principle that was guiding the agency of enslaved people and also free people of color at this time. So we're asking them, and they're learning to track Black agency during the period in beyond the binary of loyalists wanting to stay part of the British Crown versus patriot wanting to separate, but in a much more personal and localized question of what it is to, how can I get free, and how were people throughout history making this decision about what freedom looks like to them. So in tracing the individual stories highlighted in the exhibition, young people are having this aha moment. One, that emancipation and the desire to be free and self-deterministic was the driving factor in the decisions that Black individuals were making during this time. And if we start thinking with that, then we have a completely new and different understanding of the American War for Independence and the American Revolution when we study Black voices. Yeah, well, thank you all.
Thank you.
Let's give a round of applause.
Thank you all.